We're already on the 9th Commodore 64 episode, and there's still a few games left to mention from the days before I even had my own C64. One of those games was another admittedly mediocre Interceptor game, which was an unofficial port of the arcade game Burger Time. Released under the same title, unless you count having a space between burger and time as something to make it completely different. Yeah, I didn't think so either. It's basically the same game as the arcade original, but the playability is considerably less fine-tuned. The idea is to walk over all the burger elements spread across the laddery maze and avoid contact with the eggs and sausages. If you're lucky, you can try to freeze the enemies by laying a pepper spray cloud in their way, but the game is a bit buggy, so this doesn't always work as it's supposed to. What I didn't know prior to making this episode was that the theme song used for this version is an arrangement of a McDonald's advertisement tune from the 80s. My nostalgia for this game has a lot more to do with the funny cover art and the location of first experience in this game, which was a place I didn't really visit more than maybe 3 or 4 times as a kid. Interceptor's Burger Time is not as good as it should have been, nor is it as bad as it's generally considered, just cheap enough to be funny, and that's kind of the way I like it. I also feel it necessary to get at least most of the games I had during my first 6 months of owning a C64 out of the way as soon as possible, so most of the games on the list today are those, starting with another game featured in a 5-game compilation called Solid Gold. From this compilation I've already mentioned Winter Games, Infiltrator, and to some extent Leaderboard. Only 2 games are left, of which Ace of Aces I have very little experience with and recollections of, so the last game from Solid Gold will be the classic Atari arcade conversion of Gauntlet. Largely based on earlier dungeon, maze action games Dandy and Time Bandit from 1983, both originally released on home computers, Gauntlet was designed for the arcades, specifically as a 4-player unit, with hundreds of levels to blast through. It was so popular that it was necessary to port to as many home computers and consoles as possible, though the only home conversion to allow for simultaneous players was Gauntlet 4 on the Sega Mega Drive from 1993. The C64 version was one of the more successful ports though, and it solidified itself a status as one of the more common multiplayer games of its time. Gauntlet works best as a multiplayer game, but in single-player mode it just doesn't do much more than get a little more difficult and frustrating. For me, Gauntlet was never as big as it perhaps ought to have been, but it did serve as a basis for recognizing the stylistic approach in later games such as Hammerwatch and Streets of Rogue that I have enjoyed tremendously. Gauntlet is a good reminder that something as simple as this might become hugely successful and popular even still, and it need not take 100 terabytes from your hard drive. But although in its classic form, it's certainly a classic game and deserves its status, it's not something you would want to play only by yourself. Time for another joystick breaker. We have a relatively unknown sports game from Martech, branded after a famous British judoka, Brian Jack's Superstar Challenge. By the time his name was used in this game and an actual judo game Uchimata, his participation in the BBC sports competition program Superstars was dropped a few years before, and his judo career had moved from the 70s Olympic medalist days to an owner of a fitness and martial arts club before the mid-80s. So, if Brian Jack's Superstar Challenge went a bit off the radar, at least compared to Daley Thompson's sports games or Konami's more popular hypersports and track and field games, it shouldn't be much of a surprise. But what Superstar Challenge did to make itself memorable was to include some events that you normally wouldn't see in a multi-event sports game, and construct the more usual ones a bit differently. Brian Jacks being a recognizable gymnast, 2 different gymnastics events were thrown into the mix, arm dips and squat thrusts. Somehow these events, while not particularly exciting, work quite well in the mix. Other events are canoeing, cycling, swimming, 100 meters dash, an odd shooting gallery form of archery, and an event where you guide a football around cones and then shoot it at a goal. It's an unnecessarily cheap take on the concept of a multi-event sports game, but it has some charm to it, which makes me come back to it more than, let's be frank, even Gauntlet. I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anyone other than the most eager defenders of joystick-waggling sports games. It's not good, but it is fun. Another compilation I had bundled with a set of 50 second-hand games I obtained soon after getting the C64 was a lesser-known one from Data East and US Gold called Arcade Alley, which features 6 games of wildly varying genres and quality. The first game to be mentioned from this compilation is the game I probably played the most from the compilation called Express Raider. It's one of the better games for the C64 with an Old West theme, and I wrote a comparison of it a couple of years ago. Link in the description as usual. In Express Raider you control a train robber. You gotta love games where you play the antagonist, right? Well, you start off by fighting off a guard and a bunch of dogs or coyotes or something before you're magically lifted off the ground to the top of a moving train. Now you have to fight off guards, 1 per train car, until you reach the locomotive where the money bags are located. The second part of the game is spent riding a horse and shooting enemies inside the train with a similar goal in mind. That's basically the whole game, but with the difficulty level raising a bit for each loop. Although it looks simple enough, it's actually rather challenging just to get comfortable with the controls in the horse riding section. On top of the train though, it's easy enough once you figure out the strategy, which is just either jump kicking or crouch punching depending on your enemy. The reason why I think it's better than most Old West themed games on the C64 is mostly thanks to its good balance between nicely paced action, requirement for skill, a certain amount of humor, and a touch of cheapness in its production. But of course, nostalgia also has a lot to do with my preference for this game. Next up, one of the 3 Finnish games that I got to see and play before I got my very own C64, and this is probably the most famous game in Finnish language that the C64 was ever graced with, Uuno Turhapuro muuttaa maalle. The game is based on the movie with the same name, which is probably the longest standing movie series ever created in Finland, with this particular movie being the 12th from a total of 20. For what was very likely the first time ever in a Finnish computer game, Uuno starts off with an animated intro sequence, which translates the starting plot turn into a pixelated version. The idea is, Uuno's wife, Elisabeth, has left him and moved away. She doesn't say where. The only thing left for him in the otherwise empty house is the refrigerator, from where Uuno finds Elisabeth's note of departure. While Uuno is, by all appearances, a lazy, uncouth bum, he's a genius who always gets things going his own way in the end. He realizes his wife has gone off to the countryside and follows her. The game takes 3 key action sequences from the movie and combines them into a pseudo-coherent whole by having pretty much exactly the same gameplay for each of the 3 events. In the first scene, Uuno runs a plowing device behind a towing car and tries not to hit anything. In the second scene, Uuno is water skiing behind a towing boat and tries not to hit anything. In the third scene, Uuno is running around in the forest, trying to reach Uuno's father's moonshine factory before the law enforcement gets there, and tries not to hit anything. Basically, the game is little more than an impossibly long avoid-em-up, with graphics based on the Uuno Turhapuro movie characters and some very nice music thrown into the mix. Of course, I couldn't have written a comparison of this game since it was only ever made for the Commodore 64, but the blog's Finnish theme gave me a freedom to write a review of it. Again, link in the video description. Uuno Turhapuro muuttaa maalle is a game that can be considered something of a joke, but to me it's the true dawn of the history of Finnish game development, and I enjoy a game or two of it every few months or so. The last game I'm gonna mention from Ocean's live ammo compilation is not Top Gun, because I have very little nostalgia for it, even the movie to be honest. No, the honor shall go to Army Moves, a game originally conceived in Spain and originally written for the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC and published by Dynamic in 1986. The C64 version was ported by a British team and published by Ocean Software under their acquired Imagine label in 1987. I have yet to do a comparison of Army Moves, although I fully intend to do so in the near future because I always liked the game despite its stupid design choices. The game is loaded in two parts, the second one requiring a reboot and a code you get after completing the first part. The first part is automatically scrolling shoot 'em up, in which the first journey is made on a jeep with two rocket launchers on it, jumping over gaps in the longest bridge you've ever seen in any game, and the three latter levels are going in the opposite direction with a helicopter. The second part requires a lot of shooting as well, but is more of a push-scrolling platformer in which you control a loosely defined military person, first through a difficult water passage and then through an enemy base camp. If you manage to somehow get through all that, you enter a building in which you need to find some secret documents. This turns the game into more of an adventure of sorts, but only barely. Similarly to Green Beret from the same compilation, I put a lot of time into Army Moves back in the day and managed to complete the game a couple of times. I cannot with any honesty claim the experience to have been particularly pleasing at any point, but it's an accomplishment of sorts. Before I got obsessed about completing Army Moves though, the initial fun I had with the game was pausing it at the exact moment of blasting an enemy helicopter or car so that the frozen screen would show a single frame of the explosion, which would sometimes look like a pancake. Oh, the simple joys of being young. The second game to be featured from the Arcade Alley compilation is a game that should be well known for any retro gamer with practically any platform of preference. In Europe we know this game as Kung Fu Master. The Japanese know it as Spartan X, and at least on the NES the Americans know it simply as Kung Fu. Well, it's always been Kung Fu Master to me, and that's how I like to refer to it as. Irem's arcade original was released in 1984, and it is regarded as the first side-scrolling beat-em-up brawler. It's loosely based on the Jackie Chan movie Spartan X, which was released in North America as Wheels on Meals, although inspiration for the game design was taken from Bruce Lee's Game of Death. Although a hit game on practically all systems it was ever released on, Kung Fu Master has more historical significance on the NES, where Shigeru Miyamoto worked on the side-scrolling techniques, which he later utilized for the creation of Super Mario Bros. Anyway, the C64 version is almost as good as the original, barring the lack of voice samples and having some strange features in the boss fights that make it, well, a bit different is all I can say. I have managed to complete this game on the C64 and NES, although it always seems to be more of a matter of luck than plain perseverance. But it plays well, feels still unique, and is short enough to make it worth trying to complete every once in a while, just to keep your skills up. This game is also on my current to-do list, so perhaps you'll be seeing a comparison of it by the end of the year. Now, a game that I have never seen an original copy of, but was somehow always to be found on every C64 owner's collection of turbo tapes, Super Pipeline 2. Mind you, I do have a Mastertronic re-release of this game, which was released as Pipeline 2, but I have still never seen the Task Set original from 1985. I also have the original Super Pipeline, but I've never had a similar connection to that particular game, likely because I played the second one first. A story not unlike I had with Kickstart 2 and its predecessor. Not that I don't like the original Super Pipeline, rather that I like Super Pipeline 2 better. The premise is very much the same in both games. You control a handyman, who is followed by two little helpers, though I think the original had only one of them, and the basic idea is to help water or some other liquid to reach the other end of the pipe and flow long enough into the containers below to fill up your quota. The twisted pipeline is constantly being attacked and punched holes into by some random enemies that come from outside the screen, and the way to fix these is to guide your helpers to the holes and they will do the job. The helpers also act as shields for any contact with the enemies, but you can also shoot the bugs and other menaces. Just note that some of them only take damage if you shoot them from the correct angle. What I like more about Super Pipeline 2 is the more energetic music, the funnier cutscenes, and of course the additional little helper. It's probably my second most favorite game by Task Set, and I highly recommend it to any arcade-oriented retro gamers who like games with originality. Now I have a confession to make. I was never a big fan of the original Bomb Jack, not on any platform. There was just always something a bit wrong about how the game played, as you couldn't really follow its logic due to the controls and enemy behavior. I did, however, like Bomb Jack 2 on the C64, even though many people seem to completely disallow the connection to the original. And to be fair, Bomb Jack 2 started off as a completely different game, as you might well know by now. Fans of old 80s cartoons might recognize the in-game tune being actually the theme song from Thundercats. Which is, of course, a franchise upon which Bomb Jack 2 was originally built around. Anyway, Bomb Jack 2 doesn't play anything like the original Bomb Jack, which to me is a perfectly good thing. The similarity is that the levels are all the size of a single screen, and you hop around from platform to platform. The idea in Bomb Jack 2 is to collect all the shiny goldbacks from around the level, but unlike in the original game, Jack cannot actually jump in a similar manner and float as he wishes, but he can hop to the next directly aligned platform and push any wandering enemies over the edge. After a while, though, the enemies transform into more powerful ones, and pushing them drains your energy more quickly than in their original form. In their later forms, they can even jump around in a similar manner to yours, so it's advisable to find out your possible pathways as quickly as possible, and deal with the enemies in their most basic forms as possible. In my not very humble opinion, Bombjack 2 is a criminally underrated game and should be revalued for what it is rather than what it's labeled to be. I certainly play it more often than I can ever bother to attempt playing the actual Bombjack, but for some odd reason I'm still missing Bombjack 2 from my originals collection. It's thoroughly a turbo tape game for me. We end today's list of 10 with a game I could have almost as easily put into an episode of Amstrad games, which I probably should have, since I don't have all that much material for that machine. Datasoft's series of platforming adventure games were pretty much perfect on the 8-bit Atari computers, and I did mention Bruce Lee and the Goonies in connection to the Atari, but I find that Zorro was a little bit better suited for the C64. The game engine hasn't really altered that much from Bruce Lee and the Goonies, although now you are able to carry items. Running around and jumping is largely the same feel, if slightly slower than Bruce Lee. Zorro is actually like a combination of both Bruce Lee and the Goonies, with the puzzle elements taken and updated from the Goonies, and the map form and design more akin to Bruce Lee. Zorro's inevitable sword-fighting method is kind of luck-based, since the only way to fight is bashing the fire button and move around, but you have no real control over any moves. You can just as easily get killed in a surprise attack or a longer fight than kill your enemy, so it's best just to avoid fighting as much as possible and just focus on doing the puzzles. The entire plot in Zorro is ridiculously classic and overused. The evil Sergeant Garcia has kidnapped Zorro's señorita and locked her up in his fort tower, and you're supposed to rescue her. Of course, you cannot just follow them and barge in, because Garcia is too quick and has the drawbridge pulled up before you reach the fort, so you need to figure another way into the fort. Compared to both Bruce Lee and the Goonies, Zorro is a surprisingly long game, mostly because it requires a lot of running back and forth, but also because the 30-second theme tune can drive you mad after half an hour of playing the game. Other than that, it's still a classic Datasoft adventure game and highly recommendable.